continued to lose the books and pay the fines, I decided I just couldn't afford to go to the library anymore. I swore it off entirely. My mom thought that surely this was a bluff, and I just wanted her to take responsibility for these fines again. But I stuck to it. I would only borrow books on Kindle so that they could not be lost, or if I really needed a print copy of a book, I would pick it up at half-price books for a few dollars. Even now that the library has eliminated fines entirely, I'm no longer in the habit of going. My parents only intended to teach me to be responsible for the books that I was borrowing. But what I instead learned at 10 years old was that life isn't fair. My mom always used to tell me that when I was frustrated about something. Life's not fair. But my response was always, shouldn't we at least try to make it fairer? This is an overly simplistic and somewhat whimsical example of how fines directly affected me as a child. But the same principle is at work in a much more severe way in today's American judicial system. Fines often have too much or too little of a punitive impact than what was intended, and therefore do not yield the desired outcome. I believe that the solution to this is to implement a system of income-based fines in the American judicial system because they are more equitable, they are a more effective form of punishment and increase rates of payment, and they reduce mass incarceration and recidivism. Before diving into the argument, it's important to ask a few questions. What are laws? What are punishments? Why do we have them? While we may not all agree on each and every law, I think we can agree that we would not want to live in an entirely lawless society. Laws establish rights, maintain order, resolve disputes, and a law without enforcement is merely a suggestion. This is where punishments come into play. Something is generally considered a good punishment if it meets at least one of 5 goals. These goals are deterrence, retribution, incapacitation, rehabilitation, and reparation. I will be specifically discussing fines as a form of punishment. Fines meet the goals of deterrence and retribution. They are retributive because they deprive the offender of something, in this case, money. And they are a deterrent because both the offender and the general public are now aware of what the consequences will be if they choose to break the law. It shouldn't be a concern that fines don't meet all 5 potential goals of punishment. Remember, something only has to meet one goal in order to be considered a good punishment. And additionally, the goals that fines do not meet are typically for a different type of crime entirely. For example, incapacitation is typically reserved for violent offenders who pose a danger to society or to themselves. I will also be discussing the difference between flat rate fines and income-based fines. Our current American judicial system utilizes flat rate fines. This means that if 2 people are caught speeding, one who makes $100 a day and one who makes $10,000 a day, they will both pay the exact same fine. With income-based fines, however, those fine amounts would be drastically different because the 2 offenders have drastically different incomes. I will be arguing that in order for a punishment to be truly just and equitable, it should meet 3 additional criteria. First, it should have an equally punitive impact on all offenders, regardless of socioeconomic status. Second, it should be enforceable and widely applicable. And third, it should be easily utilized and sustainable. In order to fully understand income-based fines, you have to start by understanding the idea of punishment units. Essentially, the judicial system would go through the list of crimes that they would like to use fines for, and they would assign each crime a number of punishment units according to its relative severity. This can sound like a difficult and subjective task, but in reality, it's not all that different from what we've already done by assigning sentencing guidelines or a fine amount. The difference is that instead of assigning something concrete, like a number of years or a number of dollars, it's just a number on a scale. This number is then multiplied by the offender's daily income. So thinking back to the example of the two people caught speeding, one who makes $100 a day and one who makes $10,000 a day, let's assign speeding a punishment unit of 1, just to keep the math easy. The person who makes $100 a day would then pay a $100 fine. And the person who makes $10,000 a day would pay a $10,000 fine. These numbers can sound shocking at first. It's not anything we're used to. But when you remember the principle behind these numbers, both offender is paying 1 day's worth of income. Their incomes are just drastically different. Day fines are not a novel idea. They are currently used in multiple European countries with great success. In fact, we've also experimented with income-based fines in the United States before. In the late 80s, in both Staten Island and Milwaukee, we conducted experiments to determine whether income-based fines were feasible to implement in the American judicial system and what effects they may have. Both experiments were run differently, and they didn't track the data afterwards for as long as we may have liked. But what both experiments found was that such a system was easily implemented in the American judicial system, and that all of the effects seemed to be positive. They found that rates of payment increased, amounts of payment increased, and recidivism decreased. In the Staten Island experiment, judges weren't required to use income-based fines. They were simply presented income-based fines as an option and told how to use them. But judges chose to use income-based fines 70% of the time. This is especially significant because using income-based fines actually required a little bit more work for the judges. Don't get me wrong, income-based fines is not a difficult system to use. But rather than just giving the offender the usual fine amount that they likely had memorized at that point, they had to ascertain the offender's income and look at a chart to figure out what the fine would be for that specific offender. But judges still chose to do this 70% of the time, which indicates that the judges had a preference for this system and likely understood the benefits that would come from it. In order to even care about making such a change in the American judicial system, however, you first have to understand why the subjective experience of punishment matters. Alex Scheirenbeck explains this with the imaginary punishment of truncation. In this punishment, every offender is made to stand on the same red X on the ground. As they stand on this X, a blade swings above their head at a height of exactly 6 feet. For any offender who's less than 6 feet tall, this blade will swing over their head. It won't affect them at all. For an offender who's exactly 6 feet tall, they might get a bit of a haircut. But for any offender who's more than 6 feet tall, it will cut off part or all of their head. It's easy to understand that such a punishment is unjust. But if you think about it, they're all experiencing the same objective punishment. They're all standing on the same red X on the ground, underneath the same blade. But some people are completely unharmed, and others are killed. This seems like a very harsh example of an unjust punishment, but it's actually not unsimilar to the way that our current American judicial system is functioning with their use of flat rate fines. Wealthy offenders, or short people, are entirely unaffected, whereas poor offenders or tall people are incapacitated. For example, consider one of the richest men in the world, Jeff Bezos. In 2016, while he was renovating his mansion, he accumulated over $16,000 in parking tickets. Jeff Bezos was aware that he was parking illegally, and he was aware that he was receiving tickets, but he chose to continue to park illegally because the fine amounts on those tickets were so insignificant to him. He felt as though the law did not apply to him because the consequences didn't affect him. On the other end of the spectrum, we have a woman named Linda Tirado. Ms. Tirado mistakenly parked illegally and her car was towed. She was told it would cost her a few $100s to get her car back. She and her husband didn't immediately have this money on hand, so they continued to work for a few weeks to save up the money, walking to their jobs in the meantime. When they finally had the money they needed and went to get their car back, they were told that they had been charged additionally for every night that their car had been held. The amount they now owed was more than her husband and her made in a month. They had to give up the car for lost. She and her husband continued to walk to their jobs each day, each of them working 2 jobs. But sometimes it would rain and they would arrive to work wet, or it would be really hot outside and they would arrive sweaty. Ultimately, they both lost both of their jobs. And without their jobs, their family lost their apartment. Both of these people were experiencing the same punishment on the surface. They were both given a ticket with the same amount. But because of their drastically different incomes, it had a drastically different outcome. Now consider how these 2 situations might have played out differently had income-based fines been used. If Mr. Bezos's income had been considered as he was being ticketed, the fine amount might have been enough to get his attention. It might have been enough to convince him to stop parking illegally, to follow the law. If Ms. Tirado's income had been taken into account, it might have been a fine amount that was feasible for her to pay. She and her husband would not have lost their jobs and their home. Hopefully by now I've convinced you why philosophically such a change makes sense. But practically, it works just as well. All the data that we have from European countries that currently utilize income-based fines and from the experiments in the American judicial system show that it has a plethora of positive benefits. They found that both rates of payment and amounts of payment increased. This means that people were more likely to attempt to pay the fines in the first place. With our current system of flat rate fines, many offenders feel like there's no point in even trying to pay the fine they've been given because they have no hope of paying it in full. But when it's an amount that has been tailored to the offender's income and is feasible for them to pay, they're far more likely to pay it and pay it in full. Some people are concerned that if a system of income-based fines were implemented, we would actually lose money as a result. They believe that we would be giving many more fines of lower amounts to low-income offenders and very few fines of higher amounts to wealthy offenders. But in fact, the opposite is true. In countries that have made the switch to income-based fines, the quantity of fines of lower amounts does not have any noticeable change. But the quantity of fines of higher amounts increases drastically. There are many wealthy people out there who are in the habit of breaking laws because the consequences don't affect them. And as they continue to, they begin to receive fines of significantly higher amounts. All of this results in increased revenue. Now, I'm not arguing that an increased revenue is a valid reason to make a drastic change to our judicial system. But it also should not be ignored. There would be some initial costs to implementing such a system. We would have to work out some flaws, perhaps create a few new jobs to correctly ascertain the offender's income. But the increased revenue would quickly recover any costs of implementing such a system and continue to fund the judicial system. Additionally, in countries that made the switch to income-based fines, they found that fines could now be applied to a much wider range of offenses. Currently, judges feel like fines are ineffective in a lot of cases. They know that if they fine a low-income offender, that offender will just be jailed in a month for non-payment. And they know that if they fine a wealthy offender, it won't matter to them. But when the fines can be tailored to both the severity of the crime and the offender's income, that's no longer the case. Many countries that made the switch began applying fines to new crimes, such as fraud or theft. This meant that the prisons could be reserved for violent offenders that pose a danger to society. It begins to solve the issue of mass incarceration. Data shows that people who are incarcerated instead of fined are far more likely to reoffend. They've been removed from their family, their friends, their job. Their likelihood of finding a job in the future drastically drops. But when an offender is fined instead, that's no longer the case. Think back to when I was a little girl with my pink suitcase at the library. Those fine amounts seemed huge to me at 10 years old. But if they had ever gotten to be too much for me to pay, of course my parents would have stepped in and paid the fines for me. But there are many Americans in much more severe positions today who don't have anyone to bail them out. Our current American judicial system of flat rate fines is not accomplishing what it intends to. That is why I believe we should make a switch to a system of income-based fines, because it is more equitable, it is a more effective form of punishment, it increases rates of payment, and it reduces mass incarceration and recidivism. Thank you.
Well done, Grace. We're going to turn things over to the panel. Mrs. Smith.
Thank you. Great job, Grace.
Thank you.
Thank you for the privilege of working with you. It's been wonderful. My first question is in reference to the Staten Island and Milwaukee test cases. Why did this type of punishment not gain momentum and become implemented nationally if it was found to be so effective? What happened?
It all came down to bad timing, honestly. This system was implemented in the late 80s, and as they began to find success was also when the whole tough on crime movement really gained momentum. So people were less interested in fines as a form of punishment at all. No one was concerned about whether they were flat rate fines or income-based fines. They just wanted to automatically imprison offenders. And because of that, the project lost momentum. And by the time we got back to considering fines a good and effective form of punishment, everyone seemed to have forgotten about it.
Thank you.
I wanted to follow up on that just a little bit. With some of these experiments, both in the US as well as in Europe, did any of these trials involve anything equivalent to your punishment units? Or is this your unique insight?
I was primarily modeling my ideal American system off of what Sweden or sorry, what Germany currently does. The alternative is what Sweden does, which is honestly a lot more complicated. They utilized the idea of punishment units, but then multiplied it by the offender's daily discretionary income, which was defined as any money they had left over after buying the essentials, which just seemed like a number that was far too difficult to calculate, and there could be a lot of disagreement on what was essential. And so Germany's system that utilized just the daily income as a whole seemed a lot more easy to implement.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning, Ms. Burgess.
Morning.
So you were an attorney on the mock trial team?
I was.
All right, then I'll treat you as an attorney. How about that? Did you try a criminal case as part of mock trial?
Yes,
Who has the burden of proof in a criminal case?
the prosecution.
Correct, the government. So in looking at your paper and hearing your presentation was well presented, I do have a legal question. So the burden of proof being on the government,
Mhm.
you said the judge determined the income of an individual. How did the judge do that? Did the government present evidence? Because what's the burden on the defense, right? It's zero. So how did they go about with that burden of proof?
So there were a lot of different ways that they tried to do this in European countries and our experiments. Initially, what they tried to do was just ask the offender what their income was, and then compare that to any evidence they had from tax records or, what kind of car they owned.
Okay, but the defendant has invoked his right to remain silent,
Okay,
and it's not easy to get IRS records, as we read about all the time, correct? So our government is not going to be able to turn over that private information. In that scenario,
Mhm.
how do they meet their burden of proof?
so ideally, I think the way that the system would work so that as few people have access to the sensitive information of tax records while still maintaining, a true representation of their income, is that it would kind of all work in a database. So if someone gets pulled over for speeding and you give them a ticket, it would have a barcode on it. And then if you scan that barcode, you go to a website where you enter your name and your social security, and that then accesses your tax records and whatever your most recent reported income was, and would multiply it by the number of punishment units for whatever you were ticketed for. And then if the defendant wanted to protest this because, well, they've lost their job since that, at that point, the burden would be on them to go to the office of whoever gave them the ticket and say, present more information of actually my income has changed since I last filed taxes.
Okay, very thoughtful. Thank you.
Okay, you sort of answered my next question, but not that I have any experience with speeding tickets at all. Truly, I don't. But as you just mentioned that, when you have a traffic violation, there is a fine amount assigned immediately. And your children come home and tell you how much that fine was. So you sort of answered that there would be a database. Are there not major concerns with certainly with the current situation with our police force and lack of trust in a police force, that they would have access to a database that has national information on your income, my income, everybody in this room's income? What problems do you foresee if that was made accessible to our police force?
I think ideally it would be what I described, where they would just be entering the information of this is their license plate, this is what I caught them doing, and then it would be up to that person to enter that information to determine their fine amount, so that as few people are seeing that information as possible. Trust is always going to be an issue, and I definitely acknowledge that, but I don't believe that this system would open any more doors for deceit than are currently open.
Thank you.
Grace, It seems that impartiality and not considering individual and personal circumstances is the current stance of our legal system. And even in our cultural iconography, justice is often represented as being blind for this reason. So I wonder if in your research you encountered how is it that legal systems arrived at the current stance that they are in? What unintended consequences might arise from giving individual consideration to offenders? And I'll end just by saying that it seems that most children even seem to have just a natural intuition that giving special treatment is unfair.
I would argue that this system would not give anyone special treatment, or that it really leaves justice as blind. All that the judges are doing is saying, you committed this crime, which is 2 punishment units, and so that's going to be multiplied by your daily income. They wouldn't know what that is for each offender. They wouldn't be considering that when assigning the number of punishment units. No matter who's caught speeding, it's going to be the same number of punishment units. It's then just multiplied by a calculator. And I don't think that that in any way compromises the blindness of justice.
Okay, thank you.
All right, my question goes back to the thought you gave to the title of your paper. So you have excuse the rich, punish the poor, how flat rate fines are corrupting the justice system in America. The issue I want to ask you about is the word corrupting. Now, generally, the dictionary meaning of that would include that it's some form of dishonesty or fraud, some kind of fraudulent system. Is that not too strong a word for the flat-based fine system that we've had for over 200 years? Or do you believe that this system in place does have some corruption in it that you think is solved by your proposal?
So full disclosure, my mom wrote the title, but I approve.
She can step up there next.
I approved the title, and so I will defend it. I definitely understand the concern behind the word corrupting, but I think I would argue that it's not. There wasn't an intent to corrupt when this was created. When this system was designed, the intent was that it would punish everyone equally. But I don't believe that the subjective experience of punishment was sufficiently taken into account. And so I believe that as time has gone on and the disparity between different people and their incomes has increased, we've been able to see the problematic results of this system. And I believe that as we see that, it's our responsibility to make changes.
Very good. Thank you.
Grace, in your research, did you find any information pertaining to the administrative costs involved in implementation of an income-based fine system, whether it was in the test cases here in the US, as far as the dollar for dollar exchange, or overseas?
The experiments that were done in the United States were done in the 80s, and technology was not nearly as advanced as it is now. And so they were primarily relying on offenders self-reporting their income. And if there seemed to be a large disparity between what they were reporting and what they appeared to own, they would then investigate. I believe that with current technology being where it is, we wouldn't have to rely on self-reporting and having a clerk who's gathering all of that information, but it could primarily be automated and costs would be much lower because of that. Additionally, I believe that because of the increased revenue that would come from income-based fines, any costs of initially implementing the system or sustaining it would be offset by the increased revenue, and ultimately there would still be a profit.
Thank you.
I'd like to think about your example of the library. Once again, I've also had some difficulties with the library myself. So
It's real.
In these fines that you accrued in your younger days, you seem to assume that your income as a minor would be what the court would consider for evaluating the size of your fine. But elsewhere in your paper on page 17, you mentioned that it may be best to consider a family's income rather than individual. And then at even another place, you argue that, when quoting Hillsman, you say that oftentimes the current fines are fixed according to the lowest common economic denominator. So given all this, might you actually be arguing for a system that would increase your library fines and potential speeding tickets?
So the example of 10-year-old me was primarily there because it's cute. And I believe it's a good way of introducing my point. There's definitely issues about if there's someone who's 20 years old who's caught speeding, but they don't have a job. They're still living at home with their family and fully dependent on their family. Whose income do you consider in those cases? And I think ultimately that would be left up to each jurisdiction. I don't believe that there is a right answer to that problem. And it would likely differ from county to county, state to state. It's definitely a complication, but I think it's an issue that's also present in our current system. Just no one's even bothering to find out if they're dependent on their family or not.
Thank you.
All right, so I'll ask you either a legal question or a practical question. Which would you rather?
Oh, geez. Can I hear both and then choose which to answer?
I guess I'll go with the legal.
Okay.
So the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution prohibits excessive bails and excessive fines.
Mhm.
It would sound to anybody in this room that a $20,000 speeding ticket as a number is excessive, even if it's Bezos,
Right.
which if I had more question time, I would ask you, why didn't they just tow Bezos' car instead of letting him rack up 16,000? But that being the case, one speeding ticket at 20,000, would that not bring in some potential constitutional issues that maybe these other countries don't have,
Mhm.
that we as Americans do have?
So I read an entire research article on the constitutionality of income-based fines, primarily because I knew Mr. Hoshauer would be here. And philosophically, I believe that the proportionality should hold true even at the highest levels. I think that it still makes sense to give a $20,000 fine if that's what they make in a day. But practically, if we really wanted to make this happen, I think there would need to be minimums and maximums. Minimums are necessary because you don't want anyone who's unemployed and doesn't have a source of income to just be able to break the law with no consequences, and maximums to avoid the issue of the excessive fines clause. The courts have not really arrived at like a clear decision on what counts as an excessive fine. It just hasn't come up very much. But I think it would probably be safest to set a maximum at some sort of high number to avoid issues with that. The current fine maximums haven't been adjusted for inflation in a lot of cases for 20, 40 years. So any maximum that we set would still be much better than what the current maximum is.
All right.
Thank you, Grace. That was incredible.
All right, Grace, we're done with the panel and it's time for the audience. So let's remind everybody of the ground rules. And if you weren't here yesterday, let you know what the ground rules are. So the microphone belongs to me. It doesn't leave my hand, and I'm stingy and I keep it. You get one question, try to make it as efficient and clear as possible. There won't be any follow-up because I'm trying to get in as many individual questions as I possibly can. We prioritize the adults in the room and then move to students with priority on 11th grade before lower grades. All right, so with all that in mind, who wants to ask a question? Mrs. Baker has taken the role of our leadoff question. I really appreciate it. She's my icebreaker.
Grace, amazing job. I'm so proud of you. You were brilliant.
I love
But
you.
my question is, you're talking about just criminal stuff. Do you foresee any possibility to transfer any of this income-based fines to like civil cases at all?
I definitely do. Currently, there's a specific number of crimes that we believe fines are a valid penalty for. But in countries that have utilized income-based fines, they often extend it to a wider range of crimes because we've just found that it's more effective. So I definitely believe that that would be fully possible. And I think as soon as we jump through the initial hurdles of implementing such a system, it wouldn't be difficult to expand it to cover more and more crimes as we monitor the efficacy of it.
Mr. Cook has a question for you.
Grace, great job to you and your mom on a great book. If you're gonna look at subjective criteria to find a more just punishment, then why not look at other subjective criteria outside of income? So for example, you said Bezos, blew off the tickets and the other lady was incidental or even accidental. Why not consider other criteria? And maybe also including why not something other than a fine, if it would be more just? You said if people don't have income, for example.
One source I read essentially followed the idea of considering the subjective experience of punishment to its logical conclusion. And he argued that if we truly believe the subjective experience is what matters, then maybe a richer person who lives in a mansion should have a shorter jail sentence than a poor person who lives in a one-bedroom apartment, because it would affect them more severely. It would be a greater change for them. Ultimately, I concluded that I would want to stop at considering income because I believe income is something that's easily quantifiable, but it's much more difficult to understand someone's emotional state when experiencing some sort of punishment. So while I acknowledge the logic behind it, I don't believe that practically it could be done well.
Dr. Capper has a question for you.
Very nice. So at the very heart of any system of justice is justice. And you use the example of some of the European systems that have gone to this as an example of justice. In a Judeo-Christian context, which was the underlying foundation for this country for the most part, why not look at what the Judeo-Christian principle of justice is in terms of meting out fines, and what particularly in the Old Testament, when we have a theocracy, of course, where God prescribed what those laws were, they weren't done this way. They were more even distributed.
So I'm actually somewhat prepared for this question because Mr. Hoshauer asked me something similar. I think there is some basis for this in the Old Testament. When you consider things like tithe, it's not asked that everyone put 10 coins in the tithe. It's asked that everyone puts 10% of their income. It's proportional. And additionally, Mr. Hoshauer brought up the point of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And I would argue that the way the current system is working is it's taking an eye from someone with two working eyes, or it's taking an eye from someone who's already blind. It's taking an eye from both people, but the effect that it has on them is drastically different. So I don't believe that a system of income-based fines would contradict the Judeo-Christian idea of justice that we see in the Old Testament.
Colette, it's good to see you. Thank you.
So going forward, if were we to implement this income-based system, it would have great impact. I would assume specifically on Black and brown communities where those fines, especially for things like drug possession, go back to the war on drugs, there's all this connection where there's these demographics where this would have intense impact in a positive direction. But do you have any plan for people retroactively who are already in prison because they received, a fine for possession that turned into a greater fine for not being able to pay that turned into imprisonment, and now they've been in prison for years over, something small? Do you have any way to have any plan for them if this system were to go forward?
Primarily, as I was considering this issue, I was looking forward and not as much looking back. I think that it would be very legally complicated to say that, we imprisoned you because at the time you broke the law, but now we changed the law. I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
All right, I have time for one more question.
So you talked about over there that if somebody was dependent, that you could take their family income, but what if somebody was who is independent and had no income? What the punishment would be for them?
That's where the idea of minimums would come into effect, because you certainly don't want a system in which you can just quit your job and go break crimes with no consequences. So there would have to be a minimum fine amount for each crime, proportional to its severity, so that everyone is paying some fine regardless of their income.
Grace, you're done. Congratulations.